Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Tuesday, June 4th. As always, I'm your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You can follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, as always, Javiipeno, for whole months of Padres degeneracy and nonsense. So go check that out. And you can also check out my work at Just Baseball, where I write sometimes. And then also I do a podcast over there called Baseball versus the World, if you like general baseball evergreen topics. But today's show will not be about evergreen topics. It is about the now. We are talking about Tucupita Marcano's lifetime ban from Major League Baseball. That's what we're going to start off with. And then we're going to get into last night's game recap, as well as talking a little bit about Adam Mazur and just where this Padres pitching situation is. I want to say, first of all, apologies for the delayed upload. Yesterday was a little bit crazy for me, and then some developments occurred for me in the morning. So what can I say? We're a little bit late, but better late than never, folks. Let me tell you. Let's talk about this, though. Wow. Look, we've had a lot of discourse over gambling over the last few months, especially because of one Sir Shohei Ohtani. But this one, the latest one, is just another one on the long line of issues that we've seen kind of develop. Firstly, I want to say sports world has been crazy lately. So seeing all this, if you want to like tune out and just like take a break and like watch old Padres highlights like 2021 Myers, I understand that. But to talk about this, firstly, The Athletic did a nice like kind of summary by Lucas Weiss, I'm sorry, over The Athletic on this kind of summarizing it. But just to give it for people who don't know, Tucupita Marcano, among many others, a few bunch of minor leaguers were investigated by Major League Baseball, and they were found to be, guilty of placing illegal bets on Major League Baseball games. Marcano, though, is the biggest one. He has been permanently banned from Major League Baseball and is the first ban since Pete Rose in 1989. Reportedly bet over $150K across 231 bets and won just 4.3% of them. So that's pretty wild. Again, hey, anyone out there who needs help gambling wise, that's, there's plenty of resources out there, I guess, so go check that out. But others to receive punishment: Jay Groom, also of the Padres, Michael Kelly from the Oakland A's, minor league infielder Jose Rodriguez from the Phillies, and then minor league pitcher Andrew Salfrank from the Diamondbacks. The Department of Investigations found all four were MLB-related bets while they were in the minors. First of all, there's a lot to react to. And on the surface level, first of all, Marcano did have a couple games that he played for the Padres. It does not seem like these bets were made while he was at the Major League level. That's not what it seems like was happening, although they were Major League Baseball bets. Really, really nuts. Really nutty story. And we talked about this a little bit months ago when the Ohtani news came out. And I think that what we're seeing is it's just really impossible to ignore, in my opinion. It's really impossible to ignore the proliferation of gambling through not just how much it's been reported on and we've had these scandals and whatnot, but also just the sports marketing machine. And, the NBA, for example, getting really in bed with a bunch of gambling sites. I believe DraftKings, and having like on League Pass that they're experimenting, which is how you can watch like a bunch of different games that are out of your market, of course. And experimenting with putting like odds and bet things and lines and over-unders and all that stuff from the gambling realm and vernacular. So we've seen that kind of develop over these last few months. You had the Jonte Porter situation in the NBA. Obviously, we already mentioned Ohtani. Pete Rose, certainly, right? Like, there's been a lot of this, but it has increased in frequency lately. And I think that's worth mentioning, that I think there's a lot of other layers of this story. First of all, yes, I understand that, and also, by the way, it also just came out kind of wildly at the same time, is that Ipe Mizara, Shohei Ohtani's interpreter, infamously, was found, he pleaded guilty to the charges, and he will serve 33 years, by the way. That's pretty wild. This has not been an isolated incident, obviously, with Marcano, as evidenced by the Ohtani thing. I think that it's just hard to ignore that this stuff keeps coming out now. And I know that there's been some people who come out and say, we've always had gambling issues. It's like, yeah, but not on this level. And, all sports have always been rigged. Forget the gambling. Don't get me started on that. Don't get me started on the people who think that the NFL convinced everyone in the San Francisco 49ers organization, including players, team staff, heck, just people who do marketing there, to convince them all to be quiet and just play along and let the Chiefs win the Super Bowl because Taylor Swift will give them ratings. As if the Dallas Cowboys, the number one sports team in terms of revenue and just money and richness in the world, hasn't made the Super Bowl since before I was born. Yet, yeah, it's rigged for ratings. But anyway, the gambling part of that is very real, and I think that we're seeing that come out more and more. And I think that the Ohtani thing, frankly, not to get overly political on this podcast, that's not the space that I like to be political about things, but the Ohtani truther thing with all of this has been going on for a while. And while I do think that there's like a thinly disguised veil of xenophobia when people talk about the Ohtani situation, where they're like, you know, like Pete Rose, for example, like when he was like, oh, I wish I had an interpreter, that video that came out, like there's just a bad vibe to that and whatnot. But the other thing with the Ohtani situation and what makes it different from this is that, you know, the feds were like, hey, like, first of all, the feds aren't going to like cover for Major League Baseball. At least I don't think they would. Like, why would they do that? So that's crazy. And they found him out. And I think that you just have to kind of go with that. But what's more important about the Shohei Ohtani situation is, first of all, that it arised and it shows you that you could still have some outside influences that are impacted by the gambling that invade into the sports space. And it could be minor players. And that's the other part of this. Minor league players. If there's going to be, which I imagine everyone's going to talk about this, if there is a big gambling fix for a big playoff game, frankly just any game at the major league level, and you find that out, it would be, I think, there's a belief that it will be from more minor players and stuff like that. And I think that that's totally fair to bring up because, you know, there's just been such an increase of activity when it comes to gambling. Wherever you go, whenever I'm on YouTube and whatnot, like I will get like a gambling ad when I'm watching sports videos, and that's just kind of where we are right now. It just generates a lot of money, and all these leagues have kind of gotten into bed with it. But I think that there's just so much going on here, and I think that, first of all, just really stinks for Marcano, frankly. One, that you're just this gambler who clearly has some sort of issue there, and the fact that you're like I think he's 24 years old, like maybe could have sniffed the major leagues at one point. I also think it's worth talking about, in the baseball specifically, forget the NBA and NFL stuff I was talking about, that when it comes to baseball, look, sorry, again, not trying to be political, but it's hard to not ignore the conditions we know that minor league players have been in for a very long time. And while they have been getting better, while they have alleviated some of those financial burdens, it's like, yeah, I mean, this is an issue that's specific to baseball. Is like, I wonder why some minor league players might be more not encouraged, but more likely, more vulnerable to placing some bets on major league games, trying to make some more money. Because again, the horror stories you will hear about minor leaguers, like 8 people living in a house together, like all sorts of crazy stuff, and just not having enough money for food. It's hard to ignore that when we're talking about this. But when it comes to Marcano, just I genuinely like a really unfortunate situation, and they cracked down hard, and they kind of had to. Right? Like, you have to. And I think that's what we're going to keep seeing. And I don't think this is going to be the last situation either. I just don't. I don't think anyone else does either, but I just find that when you're placing all these different bets, when we have all these different issues arising, I mentioned the other ones from before, from football to basketball, it's just going to keep happening. And I'm just wondering at this point, when do we get to the moment when, you know, let's say Padres and Phillies in the playoffs, and then we discover a player on one of those teams had a bet, whether it was against themselves or it was for themselves, whatever it is, and then we find out like 2 months later. Like, that's the nightmare scenario. So part of me would think that these leagues are smart enough to figure out, like, we need to nail this down. Like, we need to be careful. But part of me is like, well, this is how people act, and we've already had some heinous examples of gambling in the past that have tarnished entire World Series, in the case of the Black Sox scandal, right? So this is a lot. Obviously, I want to see if we hear any more. But for now, I would tell everybody to ease up on the Ohtani stuff. I know that we're Padres fans, and it's easy to like hate the Dodgers. Now, I loved making fun of the Dodgers, saying that Ohtani was clean and then immediately joins the Dodgers. And oh no, see, that team curses everybody. That's fun, but I would be careful to put everything in the same bag, other than the fact that the Ohtani situation, Marcano, Jay Groom, all of these guys, that it does show you that the more increased activity in gambling has already resulted in a lot of controversies. Whether or not one is innocent, one isn't innocent, there's just been a lot. So, and it's not going to end. Not in my opinion. Not for the foreseeable future, either if gambling is distanced away from the major league sports, teams, or if they just have to take time to figure this out and lock it down. I don't know. I guess we'll just have to see, folks.